Good evening. My name is Mike Haney, and welcome to another edition of 60 Minutes in Black America. Over 7 years ago, the city of Baltimore was in a state of unrest for days due to the death of a man named Freddy Gray. Gray died in the custody of the Baltimore City Police, and his death was later deemed a homicide at the hands of Baltimore City Police. The unrest which followed was a result of decades of frustration regarding police misconduct, brutality, and particularly within Black communities. Mr. Gray's death highlighted and brought to the forefront years of concern with policing practices in Black communities across this country, as rioting and looting in Baltimore played out around the world. Shortly after the riot, the mayor at that time contacted the Department of Justice, asking for a full investigation of the policing practices of Baltimore City Police Department. Today, you will hear from the City Consent Decree Monitoring Team, which was the outcome of the Department of Justice's investigation in 2017. However, allegations of corruption, brutality, and police mismanagement is not new to Baltimore, as 100 years ago, under very similar circumstances, business leaders, citizens, judges, and city prosecutors formed in 1922 the Baltimore Criminal Justice Commission. As a result of the work of this commission, 20 police officers were indicted. A few years later, the police commissioner at that time, William L. Lawson, was indicted and subsequently sentenced to 4 years in prison on anti-corruption and fraud charges. So here we are, 100 years later, with the same concerns regarding policing. Are we finally in a position to change policing practices to the benefit of the citizens of Baltimore and in similar municipalities across this country as a result of consent decrees? Baltimore is one of 11 cities in this country currently under federal consent decree because of the practices of their police department. Chicago, Los Angeles, New Orleans, and Philadelphia are others, to name a few. Let's see how Baltimore City is doing in year 5 of its consent decree. Although a consent decree is not a crime-fighting plan, there is no doubt without the effective operations, resources, and proper attitude, no police department will be effective in fighting crime. I would like to now introduce members of the Baltimore City Consent Decree team, each bringing a certain expertise for a particular role within the decree. And so I'd like to bring into the stream first Dr. Randolph DuPont. Dr. DuPont.
Hello. Thanks, Mike.
Dr. DuPont, how are you? How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right.
Good. Could you give us a bit of your background and maybe quickly your role? I know we're going to be bringing you back on. We just want to make sure viewers know you are here.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm additional to that, I'm a professor of criminal justice and spent 15 years directing a emergency psychiatric service in a major metropolitan area. In addition to which, I've been fortunate enough to have developed a crisis program that's in about 4,000 cities. So thanks.
Fantastic. Well, we'll look to hear more from you later, Dr. DuPont, particularly in terms of your role. And so next we'd like to bring in Chief Roberto Villasandor.
Yes, good evening. Thanks for having me on.
Chief, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Good. Thank you for being here. Quickly again, you and your background, and I know we're going to have a good conversation a bit later, but we just want the viewers to know that you're here.
Yes, I served 35 years in the Tucson Police Department, served all areas. Last 7 years as the chief. I was appointed by President Obama to the 21st Century Task Force, which arose after Ferguson in New York, and I've been involved in police reform work since then.
Great. Look forward to hearing more from you there, Chief. And I believe we have Mr. Seth Rosenthal here today as well with us.
Good evening, Mike. How are you?
Hi, how are you doing, Mr. Rosenthal?
Doing well, thanks.
Good. Bit about your background and maybe your role before we get into a more in-depth conversation during the next hour with you, just so our viewers know you're here.
Sure. I'm one of the deputy monitors on the consent decree monitoring team. I've been a lawyer for about 30 years, have a background in both civil rights enforcement and criminal justice. Spent some of that time before joining the lead monitor, Ken Thompson, who's my law partner at the Justice Department, the U.S. Justice Department, prosecuting police misconduct cases.
Fantastic, Mr. Rosenthal. We look forward to hearing your contribution to our consent decree monitoring team a bit later. And then Ms. Wanda Watts. Ms. Watts.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Ms. Watts. Thank you so much. And let me especially thank you for helping make this happen today. So can you give us a bit about your background before we bring you in a bit later to really fully delve into your area of responsibility with this team?
Well, I guess the biggest part of my background with Baltimore City is that I was director of community outreach for Baltimore City Council for about 13 years. And I also did the same work for the health department before I decided to retire. And that doesn't look like it's happening.
It doesn't look like retirement either, Ms. Watson. I got to tell you, from my perspective, and as I said, we'll talk about it a bit later, as a Baltimorean, you know, your role is vital as a conduit to our city and our citizens, because, you know, we look at you with a different sort of credibility. So I want to talk about that and what that may mean a little bit later. But I want to bring Mr. Ken Thompson into the stream now. We're actually going to start our conversation with Mr. Thompson, who is the lead monitor, I believe that's his title, as he helps us define consent decree, a bit more of the history. So Mr. Thompson, you've got first up. So in addition to what everyone else has done in terms of describing their role and who they are, their background, we're actually going to start this conversation with you, because you're going to help us understand exactly what's happening and exactly what happened to get us where we are with the Baltimore City Consent Decree monitoring team. But thank you so much for being here.
Good evening, Michael, and thank you for inviting us. I'm the senior member of the team. I'm the lead member. I've been practicing law since 1977. I was in a firm at one time called Russell & Thompson. We were the largest African-American firm in the state at that time. I was primarily a criminal defense lawyer. I did that for a number of years until I went to the law firm of Piper & Marbury, where I began to do products liability and commercial litigation. So that's kind of my background. I'm a trial lawyer, and I've been doing this stuff for well over 40 years.
And you're based in Baltimore, right, Mr. Thompson?
I'm based in Baltimore. I'm born, bred, raised, educated, whatever. I'm a Baltimorean. Okay.
You're a Baltimorean. Well, that is absolutely good to know, because I wasn't certain until I delved a bit more. But I think our viewers need to understand that we actually have Baltimoreans, although we know that we have assistance and astute expertise from around the country. But we have a Baltimorean, as in yourself and Ms. Watts, that are part of this process as well. I think that's important for people to know.
As you know, Mike, if you're from Baltimore, I'm going to probably catch some booze on this, but you get your name based on the high school you went to. So I'm a City College grad, and people don't care about my college degree or my law school degree. They care about what high school I came out of. So I'm a City Forever guy.
Well, I hear you. Well, in spite of that, I'm sure that viewers will find it incredible. So, so in spite of that, Mr. Thompson, I still like you, particularly with what I have learned about you. But, could you give us an understanding of what a consent decree is, how we got there, and a bit of the role that your team plays in policing now and going forward in Baltimore City?
Happy to do it, Michael. And you did a really nice job of laying a good bit of the foundation. The Freddy Gray uprising obviously was the impetus for then Mayor Rawlings Blake requesting that the Department of Justice come into Baltimore to do an investigation. This was in 2015 and into the Freddy Gray uprising was 2015. Mayor Rawlings Blake called in the Department of Justice in 2016. Now, when the Department of Justice came and they did what's called a pattern and practice investigation, and what that means is they essentially went through millions of pages of documents over a period of a year interviewed a lot of different people, and at the end of their investigation, they made certain findings. And these findings were of no great surprise to those of us who grew up in Baltimore. They found significant events where the BPD had engaged in excessive force. They found significant events where the Baltimore City Police Department had unconstitutionally stopped, searched, and arrested individuals, again, without probable cause or without the other requisite requirements under the Constitution. In particular, with respect to people of color, and I would say, to be put a finer point on that, African Americans, most of these egregious violations took place and it involved young men who were African Americans. And so it was clear from the DOJ report that this department was in a serious tailspin. It had a lot of problems, a lot of work needed to be done. So the Department of Justice decided to file a lawsuit. And they filed their lawsuit. Now the police department in the city could have, if they chose, they could have elected to defend that lawsuit. Whether that lawsuit would have been tried in 10 or 15 years, who knows? But the city leaders, the police leaders at that time recognized that their department needed to be reformed. And so rather than fight a long, drawn-out, expensive fight, they decided to sit down with the Department of Justice to hammer out a series of reforms, an agreement that the parties at the table, and that would include input from people from the community. What was done over a period of a year was to figure out what was the best way to try to reform this department. And so what came out of that was a 500 plus paragraph agreement that listed, again, a number of reforms in, I think, 16 or 17 different areas that the parties, and with input from the community, thought this was the best way to try to reform this department. And that's what we call the consent decree. So that's how we got to where we are with the consent decree. Now, you made a really, really good point early on, and I need to reinforce that because a lot of people are confused. A lot of people think the consent decree is a crime plan. It is not. The consent decree focuses solely on reforming the police department. That's the focus. The mayor and the commissioner work on crime plans, and it's their job to figure out how to stem the tide of the violent crime and the other crime in the city. And that's not to say that there's not some interaction between the consent decree and crime in general, because one of the primary focuses of the consent decree, of course, is to build, well, people say rebuild some trust, but the truth is, I mean, I grew up in Baltimore in the 50s and the 60s, and I don't think there was ever much trust, at least with respect to the African American community and the police department. And so I would say one of the major focuses of the consent decree is to try to build some trust between the department and the community that this department is sworn to protect and serve. And so that's where there is that interaction, because if you don't have a community that trusts the police, you're never going to be able to get a handle on crime, because people aren't going to trust the cops. They're not going to feel comfortable going to them, which means crimes are going to go unsolved and the bad guys are going to stay on the street. So I just want to make that clear. I mean, you raised that point. I think it was important, but people need to understand that.
Yeah, Mr. Thompson, let me ask you a couple of questions related to that, just so that our viewers understand. You report to, or is there a reporting chain that we need to understand? You report to the judge, from what I understand.
That's correct.
Who is overseeing this consent decree, correct?
That is absolutely correct.
And from that reporting of you directly to the judge, because that's the accountability that you have as a lead monitor to the judge, the other members of the consent decree team with various expertise and backgrounds, which we'll hear from a few of them that we introduced at the top of the hour, do they report to you? Is that the reporting structure?
The consent decree, we are a team, okay? I'm the lead monitor. I oversee the entire process, but we all work hand in hand reporting to the judge. I mean, the judge is our boss. I mean, the judge oversees this entire process. This is a court order. The consent decree is not, it's a court order. It's not a social experiment. It's not a political issue. It is a court order. And so the members of my team, along with me, I'm the primary person that has the liaison with the judge, but we all report to the judge because. So
how was the team picked, Mr. Thompson? Was it by application? I noticed up on your site, for instance, community liaisons in Baltimore, there's a process for, in the 9 districts, police districts, for a community liaison to apply for that position. But as it relates to the chief and it relates to Dr. DuPont, were these applications or were they sought after because of their varying expertise in various areas that the consent decree is mandated to assist Baltimore City in evaluating and changing?
Let me try to give you a comprehensive answer to your excellent question. And I don't know if this goes back now to 2017, so we're almost 5 years ago. I think there were 27 different teams that applied for this position. We went through a series of interviews. We met with the communities, various communities around the city. And I'm not mistaken, I think this process took, maybe four months. I think we started maybe in April, and we ended up in October being appointed. But in the meantime, what occurred, each team that applied had to pass certain bars. And the first interviews, they weeded out a good number of teams. They had a second set of interviews, weeded out even more teams. And I think it was late in the summer of 2017, probably July or August, where there were essentially 2 teams left, if I recall correctly. It was the Venable team, which my partner and Randy DuPont were members of, and you had the 21st Century policing team that was led by Chuck Ramsey. And it's interesting that you raised this. You're really testing my memory, but I'm doing the best I can to remember. The judge, who really gets to have a lot of say about who the monitor was going to be, because the monitor was going to have to work for him and he had to be comfortable with that monitor. He liked both teams. And so what he did, rather than pick one team over the other, he decided that he was going to mix the teams up. So he picked me as the lead monitor. He picked Chuck Ramsey as my primary principal deputy monitor, and Seth was a deputy monitor. Hassan Aden, who came from 21st Century, was a deputy monitor, and Theron Bowman was part of the Venable team. He was a deputy monitor. So it was the judge essentially combined 2 teams, made them into one, because he thought they both offered the kinds of qualities that he wanted, the kinds of expertise. And so that's how we ended up with the 22-person team. It's changed a bit over time, but that's how we ended up with the one team that we are. And it's one team. It hasn't been 2 teams since the beginning. I mean, it was a nice thing about it. We all had some anxiety because we all were competing, but it didn't take long. I would say it was a matter of months a month or less than a month before we recognized that this team would work well together, and we've worked extremely well together. I am so happy to have the kinds of experts that both the 21st Century team brought to the table, along with the team that Seth and I put together.
Well,
so,
you guys, you did an excellent job of answering that question, Mr. Thompson. We're going to get to your team and members of your team. One final yes/no question: are members of your team paid, and is that money that comes out of the city of Baltimore that they're mandated to contribute to this?
Yes.
Okay, great, fantastic. And we hope to get back to you with some other questions. Well, I want to get back to you with some other questions. So let's just get to a couple members of your team. And I've got Mr. Rosenthal up, who is a deputy monitor responsible for the technological and assessments aspect. Mr. Rosenthal, is that what you are responsible for as your role?
Well, it's one of many things I'm responsible for, but what I've been tapped to talk about tonight. So happy to just give you a brief overview of our assessments work. We have likened the reform process to tearing a house down to the studs and rebuilding it back up from the ground. The first thing that BPD has to do in each of those 16 or 17 areas that Ken mentioned of the consent decree is to revise their policies. After a policy or policies are revised in a particular area, they have to then train their officers on those new policies. It's at that point that we need to come in and do comprehensive assessments of how the department is doing in a particular area. It is at that point that we need to do our assessments. Of course, we are assessing the policies that they're revising, and of course, we are assessing the training that they're doing, right? We're observing those things. We're also providing technical assistance to them. But our core function, particularly at this point in the consent decree process, now that the vast majority of policies have been revised, and now that officers have been trained on the vast majority of those policies, is to find out how well BPD officers are doing in each of the areas of the consent decree. So as a, for instance, a few months ago, we put out our first comprehensive assessment on the training function. How's BPD doing on training? We also put out our first comprehensive assessment going back to Freddy Gray and the importance of Freddy Gray to the consent decree process, how it's doing on transportation and persons in custody, whether it's transporting people or prisoners safely, right? We're in the midst of doing a very comprehensive assessment on use of force and how the department is doing on use of force. We're beginning.
Hey, Mr. Rosenthal, if I can
yes,
ask
please,
you a
go
question
ahead.
so our viewers can follow us, is the report that you're referring to, the update that you gave on these various areas which were crucial during that Freddy Gray incident, is that the 7th quarterly report you're referring to that was produced in February, where you graded out a few areas, or are you referring to another report?
So our reports are actually incorporated into that semi-annual report, but we produce freestanding reports on both training and transport, and those are all also up on our website. Got
you. I apologize, but just want to make sure, because one thing that I found with the website is very transparent. The information's up there. And if our viewers want to see what you're referring to, I think you just mentioned they can go to the Baltimore City Consent Decree website and pull down that report with your findings, correct?
Yes, actually, the best place to go is probably our own website, which is www.bpdmonitor.com.
Got you.
So anyway, just to kind of close the loop on the assessments work we're doing, we're required to do these assessments in each area of the consent decree to see how BPD is doing. One of the things that has gotten us hung up, and one of the things that's gotten the department itself, BPD itself, hung up on the assessments is just how deficient and backward their IT or technological systems have been. This is a department that, when we took up the monitorship, was stuck in the 20th century in terms of technology. So there were certain things that you could look at and actually say, okay, this is how BPD is doing. You could take a look, for instance, at use of force, because most of the stuff on use of force was there. They had to upgrade their database on use of force incidents so that we could actually do the assessment that we're now doing. But there were certain things that we just couldn't do and still really can't do. The biggest thing was on stops and searches, okay? BPD officers, for stops, searches, and arrests as well, up until last summer, were filling out paper forms. Right? This is a department in the 21st century that was filling out paper forms to document their stops, searches, and arrests. Last summer, they rolled out and have now fully implemented in the field a system of electronic field-based reporting. So everything is now kept in a new database. We are discovering that there are certain things, certain bugs that still need to be fixed within the database to make sure that all the required information under the consent decree is being reported, but we're working through those. And so hopefully, in the coming months, we'll be able to begin assessments, and BPD will be able to begin its own internal audits on crucial areas like stops and searches, which, as Ken mentioned at the outset, was one of the biggest things that got BPD into hot water. The fact that they weren't stopping and searching people in a constitutional manner and based on their race.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate the information. Let me just ask you a question. We're right at our point in terms of the run of show, but I do have a question based on what you mentioned, stops, searches. You referred to something in the 7th semi-annual report, and maybe this is part of what the reporting requirement allows you to track, that talks about RWOC, or what I think it's called what is it called? Release
without
cause,
charge arrests. Yes.
Release without charge, right? So this is a tool that apparently officers may have used to detain, individuals without necessarily, or arresting individuals. Can you explain what release without cause is and how that is a tool that was detrimental to communities, particularly Black communities?
Sure. I'll start by saying that the progress that BPD has been making on the number of release without charge arrests going down is one of the things that makes us at least cautiously optimistic about the prospects for full reform. But one of the things that the Justice Department learned in its investigation was between 2010 and 2015, BPD was making over 2,000 arrests a year that resulted in immediate release without charge. And what that means is that officers were arresting people on the street, taking them down to central booking, and the prosecutors at central booking, who were responsible for reviewing the arrest reports, thought so little of the charges that the officers had arrested these folks for that they were releasing them, at the doorhouse of the jail, basically. So they were bad arrests. They were arrests made without probable cause, right? And that at that point in time was indicative of just how poorly officers understood what they were supposed to be doing under the Constitution.
Wow.
You have all these arrests where, prosecutors literally at jump are saying there's not probable cause here, so let's get rid of it. One of the things that BPD is required to do under the consent decree is to determine each quarter how many of these RWalk arrests there are. And one of the things that has been, as I said at the outset, pleasantly surprising for us is that when they started doing this almost 2 years ago, the numbers had come way down from 2010 to 2015. There were still about 600 a year. Right now, so over the course of now 21 months, they've brought it down to around 10 a quarter, so less than 50 a year.
Wow.
Which does suggest that there are some things that are potentially going right. Now, I want to say that these RWalk arrests are not a perfect proxy for determining whether officers are arresting people with probable cause. But it does suggest there's better coordination with the state's attorney's office, that maybe the training is taking hold, and that officers are exercising their discretion more judiciously than they used to.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Rosenthal, and I appreciate it. And I got some more questions for you later, particularly when it relates to the relationship with the state's attorney's office, because we know around this country there are issues with policing and some of the reform that's going on in state's attorney's office. I know San Francisco is having an issue. Matter of fact, I think they're recalling or attempting to recall their state's attorney or their state's attorney out there. So I got more questions for you. But before we bring in Chief Valasandor, let's go to the 60 Minutes in Black America halftime show quickly, 30 seconds. And the bigger thing that I want to talk about during this halftime is the amazing production team that we have. This is the 43rd straight show every Sunday that we produce. And this is the first show where we have young people led by a fantastic mentor that has produced this show. And so I want to bring Mr. Leon Thomas, the producer now of 60 Minutes in Black America, into the stream. Mr. Thomas.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic, man. Just quickly, first of all, thank you for bringing the professionalism. Black USA News is intended to bring communities, particularly communities of color, together throughout this nation. And the more professional we look, we feel, and today feels really good, man. You guys switched me from a computer that I'm going to throw out the window as soon as this show is over quickly so that this show started on time. But you got a couple of members of the team helping you today. Can you bring them on, let them explain very quickly who they are, and we'll give viewers an opportunity in the future to understand these young people.
Right. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the opportunity to work with you and Black USA News. We're just so excited for our partnership, but also the experiences that it allows our students to have. You see here on the screen, we have Jasmine Pollock and Jeremiah Nixon. Jasmine and Jeremiah are both students at Warner University in Florida. And with my company, the Leon Thomas Group, one of the things that we like to do is reach out to folks and provide opportunities for students to gain real relative experience. And so I want to tell you how I met them, and then I'll allow them to say some things. I met Jasmine through LinkedIn because she saw a couple of posts that I made, and she didn't just sit there. She reached out and said, "This is what I want to do. Will you help?" And a good friend of mine, Dr. Jay Rasenko, a college friend who understands race, who understands that Black students don't get an opportunity. He's with us today. He's working in the background as well. And I said, "Jay, Jasmine wants to do something." And he said, "Okay, great. What are we going to do? Let's get going." So Jasmine has her own show, a sports show. She'll tell you about it. And we brought in Jeremiah Nixon, who is a frequent guest on Jasmine's show. And I said, "Look, we have some opportunities for both of you to do some things. Are you interested?" Yes, they are. So Jasmine, you go ahead first. Tell everyone about your show and everything else that you do. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Leon, and thank you, Michael, for allowing us to help you with your show. This is amazing. But a little bit about my show. My show's called Jasmine Pollock's First Impression Sports Talk. It airs Mondays at 9 p.m. Eastern, and we talk all things sports. I am a huge sports lover, from hockey, Lightning won today, to NFL, to college football, basketball, NBA, all you name it. I'm just a huge sports lover, and I love to talk about it.
All right, thank you, Jeremiah. We got Jeremiah, you're off to unmute there, my sir.
Oh, my
there you go. You're good. You had it off because when you're out of the stream, you don't talk. So go ahead.
Exactly. Well, I major in sports management at Warner University. But, originally, I like getting that rush of just bringing up big ideas and also brainstorming, especially being on Jasmine's First Impressions as like a guest speaker at different times. It's a great way for me to kind of build myself and just feed off of her a lot of things that she does, and then, kind of build it to where I'm going to, especially in my career.
All right, great. So, Michael, that's our team. We have other students that work with us that are working on other projects today, or that weren't available scheduling wise for them. But
exactly.
we like students to make it.
Yeah, I met a couple of them yesterday in our production meeting, and I will acknowledge them at the end. And Jay, I see Jay, so let's give Jay a second. Jay, might as well, can't bring you on the screen, man, and not let you shut your mic down.
How you doing, Mr. Haney? I'm Jay Rasenko. I've been friends with Leon for a long time. We came up with this concept of what we're doing here, helping the young college students out, and they all been great. And now it's a pleasure to be working with you and your team also, Mr. Haney.
I appreciate that, Jay. I appreciate you and Leon, and moreover, what we're doing for these young people to give them experience and background, so when they complete their degrees, as Tamar, who hopefully will meet next week, they come out with the experience, the relevant experience of doing things like this. So thank you, team, so much for being here, and it has gone absolutely awesome. Thanks a lot. And so
Great.
Now let's bring back into, and by the way, just for Jasmine, and she can go away. Jasmine, I know the Lightning won today, and I think they're still down two games to one to the New
Rangers.
York Rangers, right?
Yes.
2-1. So we keep up on sports too. Go Lightnings, right? We want to pass to NHL titles, right?
Yes, back to back.
Wow, good. We have to go to a hockey match together, okay?
Sure.
And so now we've got Chief Roberto Valesindor that will talk with us about community policing. Chief, how you doing? First of all, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Because that's
Kind of close,
important to me.
Mr. Haney.
You
It's
shake your
via
head like
senor.
that means
It's
no. Tell me how to
no.
pronounce your name, Chief.
Sure. It's via senor.
Via senor. Okay,
There
well,
you go.
I won't forget that, but I'm just going to call you Chief for short. But before we get into your area of community policing, off of what Mr. Rosenthal just talked about with RWOCs or what we measured in terms of people that were held without, cause. What is the difference between detain and arrest? So detain and arrest, do they both require handcuffs? And so
Not
what does that mean?
necessarily. No, not necessarily. You can detain an individual if you have reasonable articulable suspicion that they're involved in potential criminal activity. So it's enough where you may not know they committed a crime, but a reasonable person would say, I think they are involved. You can detain them to investigate. However, when you want to move into an arrest, you have to have probable cause at this point, which is a higher level of suspicion and acknowledgement of what they've done, that they have committed the crime. And so there's different levels. So you can detain without arresting, but to arrest, you have to have probable cause.
And arrest to us means that you got handcuffs on. And I just want to be clear in this because a couple of things have cropped up the past couple of days, particularly in Baltimore City, relevant to people outside of 7-Eleven, for instance, that may have been, there may have been probable cause for looting, right? And so they were detained, but they had handcuffs on, right? And subsequently released. But
Sure.
Is this a tool that is used in communities that is not the most positive way to define detainment by putting handcuffs to detain people as you do a field investigation?
It's a very complicated issue, and there could be reasons why you may handcuff someone that is simply detained, whether they're showing a proclivity to flight and you don't know yet if they're really involved, or if it's a safety issue for the officers or a victim who may be nearby. There could be reasons for handcuffs. However, you really want to make sure of your reasoning before you go to that point. And it shouldn't be an automatic.
Absolutely. Well, Chief, I absolutely hope that we have time at the end because I have some follow-up questions relative to that. When you talk about someone handcuffed, detained, can't flee, because that means at that point they are detained and they can't go. They can't go. They're essentially under arrest.
That is correct.
Right. So we'll talk about that, but let's hear from you about your community policing relative to the consent decree, a bit of the background regarding that with Baltimore City, and maybe a bit of the accomplishments that you've had so far.
Sure. Community policing is nothing new, although it seems to come up cyclically and saying that what we need is to go to community policing. Well, community policing has been around probably since Sir Robert Peel back in, I think it was 1829, developed 9 principles about policing. Now, I'm not going to go over each one, but some of those principles talked about that police need to recognize that their power comes from those who are governed and those who are policed, and that their acceptance has to come from the public accepting their use of that power. The fact that use of force and excessive use of force or compulsion can diminish that acceptance. There's a variety of things that you need to work with, and public, the famous saying from Peel is that the police are the public and the public are police. They should not be separated, and the police should be working under the direction and guidance of what the public finds as acceptable. And part of developing that community police is keeping that relationship between the police and public active. And I think that's something where you see not only in Baltimore, but a lot of agencies that are having problems is that there's an us and them mentality and a separation between police and the public that they serve. And there shouldn't be. The police should be very tuned in to what the public wants, because police may say, well, you want everyone arrested. And that may not be what the community wants. The community may want, no, we want to see that, there's not this type of crime because you've helped the city clean up an area. There could be different things that are needed. And so you got to make sure you're in tune with what the people want. So what Baltimore did is that they did get community input in developing their community policing training that they just completed recently. And it's sending every officer through 2 days of training. And the training was fairly well received, even though it does talk about the history and the problems that Baltimore police have had. Because one of the first things we talked about on the 21st Century Task Force is that police need to acknowledge their history and why it can often be problematic with how they are viewed and accepted within certain communities, particularly communities of color. And so when you accept that and you acknowledge, yes, we understand there's issues here, there's things we mistake, but how do we move forward? And don't say this is how we're going to move forward, but use those words, how do we move forward, and get that input and feedback from the community. You may not see eye to eye on everything, but if you have a conversation and you're talking about it, it's going to be much better, the end result. And
Wow.
I think that by bringing the community in to develop the training and observe the training and work with the department on that, you can develop a more acceptable training program that will help turn things around. But it's a long journey. Don't think because we went through 2 days of training on community policing that things are all better now in Baltimore. This is going to be a multi-year thing. After the monitoring team is gone, these efforts need to continue.
Wow. Well, I appreciate that, Chief. And I got to tell you, I poured through hundreds of pages of documents and have never been more impressed in terms of or optimistic that a change could take place depending on the implementation strategy and the oversight, right? Because the methodicalness that you guys are going through this and the areas you are covering, like the technological and assessment piece, the community policing piece, it is absolutely stunning. The training piece with the field officers being trained, promotions. And I think that we talked about, what was it, a Public Integrity Bureau or something of that nature, PIB, in which you look to have 85 officers, staff there, and their job is to what, Chief?
Well, they're going to uphold the integrity and the ethics of the department.
So
when
they
there's
investigate
misconduct,
complaints
they
of
investigate
citizens, right?
And bring forward the complaints to a proper resolution.
Yeah, and that's important from a credibility standpoint.
Absolutely.
That you have recommended that sort of emphasis on issues in the community where we can go somewhere and have it investigated and there's credibility. So hopefully we have time at the end to talk a bit more, because I have a couple of questions about your area of the deal, such as the 900 patrol officers that we need based on what you guys have researched, but we only have 700 in the streets of Baltimore out of over 2,500 employees, 900 officers. Optimally, 700 realistically, and with the issues we have, we're wondering, are those the numbers that we need? So I hope that we can get back to you, but so that we can get to Dr. Dupont and Wanda Watts, I want to move on to them. But thank you so much, Chief, for providing that information. And so Dr. Randolph Dupont, important aspect of this in terms of dealing with behavioral. Dr. Dupont, thank you so much for being here today. I know you're a renowned psychologist, and I believe that's it from around, you do work around the country. But let's talk about behavioral as it relates to Baltimore City and some of what you're doing to help us understand, educate, particularly within our police department.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity. One of the things I'm really excited about this consent decree is it really was forward thinking before a lot of things came into fruition last summer. What the emphasis of this consent decree is how to decrease the need for the police response and how to move that response into the community behavioral health system so that we can get the kind of quality service that Baltimore citizens deserve. So I'm pretty excited about that as well. It really is an emphasis of this consent decree, not just to improve the response of the police, but to involve the city, the behavioral health system in a joint partnership to make a difference for citizens, to be able to give them access to health care. And I think that's a very exciting part.
And so I think the reason that we look at this, because many incidents that we see between police and citizens is because there are issues that may be mental instability and so forth and so on. And so we may call the police to intervene in a crisis or a situation when we're not calling on the right sources, and therefore it may trigger negative responses from the police. Is this kind of where we're going with that in terms of dealing
To
with
some
that?
extent, I think, yeah, I think we want to maximize the police capacity and ability to respond to a crisis event. But short of that, we're also looking to ask the question of, can we also improve the relationship between the police, the city, and the behavioral health system to make a big difference? And I think that's where we've made the most progress. We're seeing a major commitment on the part of the city, major financial commitment to bring really good quality health care, mental health care to those in need and the citizens of Baltimore, so that it doesn't develop into a crisis that would involve the police. And I think we're having some pretty good success in that area.
So how about related to the hiring of police officers who may not be from a behavioral or mental stability the best suited for the job? Is there something in the recruitment process that you're aware of in terms of the evaluation and recruitment of officers that at least gives us a start that we're dealing with people that have a bit of stability in their background and their previous behavioral behavior?
Yeah, and that's while I don't get into the screening stuff, what I do understand from our own team is that they are doing better psychological screening and therefore getting officers that indeed would be more amenable. One thing I should note is that in the academy, they have really increased and improved their mental health training. They're up to 24 hours now. That's a pretty significant amount. In addition, every officer is going to get 8 hours and more each year to go with that 24. And finally, those that take leadership in the area pick up another 40. So
Wow.
we're talking about some major commitment. And I think you're going to find a difference. I'm seeing a difference now in the kind of response the younger officers are making to the training. It's very positive.
Yeah, it was enlightening to read and hear about the technical training and the online training that the officers can have, because any training is good training when it's focused and developed in the right direction, but giving them access to it, which it seems as though that they have, and particularly the field officers, the field training officers that are responsible for the newly hired police officers and how they get off to a good start. It was very intriguing, enlightening, and exciting to see how we've invested in field training. But let's get to Ms. Watts, Dr. DuPont, and hopefully you can hang around for a bit, because I think we're going to have 2-3 minutes left at the end, and I can shoot a question or two out to the group at that point. We see all of you on the screen at the same time. So let's bring Ms. Watts into the stream.
I'm back.
Ms. Watts, thank you so much. Enlightening. I feel like I'm in a speed dating thing because of all these wonderful experts here that you kind of helped us bring together. I was mentioning at the top of the hour during the introductions how I see your role from my perspective, only speaking for me, that is much crucial. Now that I know Mr. Thompson is a graduate of City College in Baltimore, really, just kidding, Mr. Thompson, right? Really look at your role as crucial as the lead community liaison, right? So could you go in and explain very specifically what your role is? We know your background is in community relations, et cetera, but as it relates to this and getting this information out, how do you do it and how do you lead this community liaison team?
Thank you, Michael. And I must mention, I'm a Western Dove. So
I'll accept that, because we got a few of those I know that are watching this show, right? So that's good.
Yes. And as a community liaison, it's my job to do things like this, bring our audience into a live setting where you as the host can ask the questions that the community needs to hear. This process cannot work without community involvement. And so it is our job. We have 9 community liaisons, 1 in each police district, who are available to educate and inform the community about the consent decree and to let them know how they can actually participate in the process, because this cannot be just one-sided. It cannot be just police and then not have community involvement, or cannot be community driven and not have the police involved. It has to be a joint effort. And so we bring people together to actually let them know how they can participate. And I want to give you, the audience, our website information, which is bpdmonitor.com. And on that website, there's also a space where people can actually go in and anonymously, and I say that again, anonymously give a complaint or give a situation, and someone will respond to them. And they don't have to worry about whether or not that information is going to be shared with anyone. It is anonymous.
Right. I appreciate that, Ms. Watts. Ms. Watts, I'm going to ask you a question, and then I want to bring everyone on the screen because I want to see everyone on the screen at the same time for our last 5 or 6 minutes. I've got a few questions. Your role on the ground to communities is one that we look at your credibility of what you're saying. Being on the inside as a Baltimorean, even though, as I mentioned, Mr. Thompson's a Baltimorean as well,
Right.
Understanding the history of policing in this city and the atrocities and the relationship between community and police, 5 years in to this consent decree, what is your evaluation on a scale of 1 to 10? Understanding, as the chief said, it's going to take years to undo and implement things. What is your take on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of the effectiveness of the consent decree at this point?
You know, we are in the very beginning stages. As Seth mentioned, that actually none of this was computerized until June of last year, 1 year ago. And we can see now that there is being progress made. The training has taken place that we can actually see. Now, the biggest part is going to be, will we be able to see this on the ground? Will our community members be able to see change, real change? And so we're just at the very beginning, and we should be able to get back to you next year.
So you're not going to
and hopefully we'll see some changes.
So what you're saying is you're not going to give me a scale of 1 to 10.
No, I'm not. I'm sorry.
Years. Okay, well that's fine. I appreciate.
Well, because 5 years, we're really just at the beginning, Michael. That's the thing that we have to remember.
And you know what? I think that the community understands that, and I think that you all understand a community in crisis as we were in 2015 when Freddy Gray, erupted, and the decades, because we talked about since 1922, Baltimore has had issues with policing continually. And my mother was one of the first Black police women in this city. So I've been around policing, much of my life. But I think at some point people look at, when do we begin to make movement forward? So I'd like to bring the entire team in. And again, Ms. Watts, thank you so much for leading this effort to have your team in. But I'd like to bring the entire team in. We got 5 minutes left, and I've got a couple of questions. Dr. Rosenthal, you're there. And is Mr. Thompson still with us?
I'm still here.
There's Ken.
I did not tell them to kick you out because you're a city grad, man. I mean, I didn't tell them that. But Mr.
You're
Rosenthal,
not a poly graduate, are you? You sound like one.
Absolutely. I went to Northwestern High. You guys just closed our school down, but we're going to open it back up, Mr. Rosenthal, just one question for you. When you look at things such as the Gun Trace Task Force, we know that We Own This City has just come out, just concluded its 6 mini-series last week. And this is what we see when it is a view of policing, right? We Own This City and the Gun Trace Task Force, right? Is this what Baltimore policing was about prior to your team or the consent decree monitoring team getting involved? Is this what you're seeing? Are we at the end of it, or we still have issues with it? Because until you rid of most of the bad apples, because I don't think you ever get rid of them, can you really input the good that you guys are doing? Where are we at with this We Own This City mentality of the Baltimore City Police Department?
Yeah, well, look, we have a pretty good sense of what's going on in the department. we don't have any reason to believe that the kind of corruption and criminality that you saw within the gun trace task force and other plainclothes units is still going on. We do have some confidence in what is happening in the Public Integrity Bureau right now. There was a comprehensive report that was issued in January after a 2-year independent investigation by Michael Bromwich, who's a former Inspector General of the Justice Department, to get at the root causes of the gun trace task force scandal, why it happened, right? One of the things, and there are several, and we don't have time to go into it now, was the woeful inadequacy of the internal affairs function. And we are seeing improvement in the internal affairs function. We did a comprehensive assessment of the quality of internal investigations in 2018, right when we started, and it was abysmal. The record keeping was abysmal, and the quality of the investigations was wanting. We are currently doing a more informal assessment of investigations done in 2021, and we are, at least anecdotally right now, seeing vast improvement, not only in record keeping, but in the thoroughness of the investigations and in the quality of the findings. And if you can turn around the internal affairs function in the department, the hope is, and I want to emphasize that it's the hope is that you won't see that kind of corruption again. You can never say.
So you put
the
internal affairs, and I believe your diversity committees are now part of your PIB now. You included those in the PIB, or the Baltimore City Police have included internal affairs within the PIB bureau. Is that accurate? I thought.
Yeah. I mean, I'm using the colloquial internal affairs. It is the Public Integrity Bureau. That is the internal affairs function.
Okay, got you. So public integrity and internal affairs, those that investigate issues with the police department and the police department investigating issues internally themselves, are within the same umbrella organization or area now, correct?
Yes, correct.
Great. Hey, Chief and Mr. Thompson and Dr. DuPont, you can fill in and you can answer this as well. So I read somewhere where we need 900 in your report, in your 7th semi-annual report, where you say that 900 police officers, patrol officers, are necessary on the streets of Baltimore, right? And we currently have 700, I believe, or somewhere around that amount, of the thousands of Baltimore City Police Department employees, civilian, uniformed, etc. Is that enough? Is that enough police officers, given the issues with crime and justice that we have in this city, even what you believe needed versus what we're actually using?
Let me start, because I think we try to do things from a data-driven perspective. We try to stay away from guessing about things. And experts actually did an analysis to determine just how many police officers were needed, and in particular, how many were needed in patrol, because that's what you're thinking about. So that's what you're talking about. And to answer your question, the staffing report indicates they need a certain number of officers. They're so far below that it is scary. And I'll tell you why it's scary. First of all, you've got a tremendous amount of violence in this city. You don't have enough patrolmen on the street. That's a problem in and of itself. But beyond that, just in terms of the stuff that we do as the consent decree team, we're trying to make sure that we have supervision of the right kind of supervisors who can supervise these police officers who are on the street. And we want to make sure we have a credible public integrity bureau. Well, if you don't have enough detectives to do the investigations, if you don't have enough qualified supervisors, I don't care about, you can have all the training in the world. We're going to have a problem if we can't figure out a way to up the staffing. And so I know we're running out of time. So quickly, what I think the mayor is trying to do is that they're trying, and the commissioner, they're trying to introduce more civilians into the department so that they can release some of the sworn police officers to go back into the street. But I'll tell you that the staffing is the most frightening aspect of what we're seeing right now, Michael.
Good. Thank you very much. And just a final question, because you're right, Mr. Thompson, we are running out of time, but I pre-warned everyone that we may go 3 or 4 minutes over, and I really appreciate this conversation. I hope that you all would be willing to come back again But Chief, let me ask you a question related to the relationship between city prosecutor, state attorney, and the number of police officers that we are short or want to join. Is there an issue because of the perception by police officers that they're not supported in Baltimore with their arrests, and that's why the number of arrests are down in certain areas that you measure, and why we are having recruitment issues? Is that, in your estimation, part of the problem?
Well, Mike, that is such a great question because I think that is an issue that is facing departments across the country, not just in Baltimore. Because it's not only police that face staffing issues, you have city prosecutor's office and state attorney offices that also have staffing issues or workload issues. They just can't keep up with the number of cases that are brought in or the number of arrests that are being made. And so that's why you see sometimes, I'm not saying that was the cause for the AWOC issue in Baltimore, but I know in other jurisdictions, there's often times where it's a good arrest, but the prosecutor just doesn't have the staff or capacity to follow up with a charge. So that's a time when the leadership of the organizations need to work together and to say, okay, these are the main issues that we want to address in our community. So direct the officers to pay attention to these areas and not necessarily the other stuff that the officers have been paying attention to. Recruitment is an issue because policing has been under attack for 5 or 10 years here now, whether some will say rightfully so. But the issue is it's hard to attract people to this profession at this point in time when everyone is so critical of it. And so it's an ongoing topic of conversation at all the jurisdictions that I visited or talked to or a conference I go to, and everyone is facing that problem. I will say Baltimore is held up as an example for some of the most progressive and ingenious methods to try and go out and recruit individuals. But at the same time, they're recruiting new officers. They have other officers who have just been burned out or tired of it because they're so understaffed that they're leaving. So I agree with Ken. It is probably one of the most serious issues that we're facing here in Baltimore.
Well, I appreciate that answer. I appreciate each and every one of you being here. And I got to tell you, based on the hundreds of pages, and I'm still reading through some of your previous reports to the 7th semi-annual report, because I found it intriguing, enlightening, and I'm very optimistic that things can change, and that consent decree outline that I saw should be a model for urban police in cities across America. But Wanda, if you could give us the website that people can go on and see one more time for themselves what's happening in Baltimore City relative to policing and this consent decree monitoring team.
The website is bpdmonitor.com. Again, bpdmonitor.com. And there's a list of our community liaisons on the website itself, and they can reach out and contact them individually if they'd like.
Great. Thank you very much, Wanda. And Mr. Thompson, any final thoughts or words from you as the lead monitor? Anything you want to say and convey before we sign off?
Michael, first of all, let me thank you again. This has been very helpful to us. And Wanda made a point, and I have to emphasize it. We cannot do this without the help of the community. I mean, we have 20 folks. We're working our butts off, 24/7, trying to get this thing done with the Department of Justice. But we need the community's involvement, and so it's so important that the community participate. I mean, we do a lot of outreach. We try to get people to participate in the training programs. We try to get people to make comments, and some of those comments don't have to be critical. I mean, some cops are doing some really, really good work. And so we want to have comments from the community so that we have a better feeling in terms of where we think this consent decree is going. So those would be my final comments.
Well, I appreciate that. You put together a heck of a team, Mr. Thompson, or you guys have a heck of a team combined. However it came, a heck of a team. And Chief Ramsey, who I know intended to be here as part of that team from Washington, D.C. and subsequently Philadelphia. Thanks again. You're watching 60 Minutes in Black America. We talked about consent decrees today, and we look forward to seeing you next week. when we will have candidate Wes Moore for governor of the state of Maryland, for a conversation with 60 Minutes in Black America. And before I go, I'd like to thank Mr. Joshua Evans and Mr. Tamar Wirtz, who were not here as part of the production team and watched this awesome close. Thank you very much for joining the 60 Minutes in Black America.